20. We're recording. I hope that's okay with everyone. You can turn off your cameras if it's not okay. So just to repeat, I have my dear colleague and friend Evren Savcı here from Yale University, and we're going to be discussing her book, Queer in Translation, that was published in 2020 by Duke University Press. So welcome everyone, and I'd just like to introduce her, and she's going to continue with a presentation on the book, and we'll have some time for questions and a discussion, and I hope that we'll be able to discuss her current work, which I'm not going to blabber about. I was meaning to, and you're going to be happy that I don't, because some things have changed, and she's done a recent ethnography, and I'm sure she'll be able to give us a real great update on where she's at with the second book. So Savcı's work is on the intersections of language, knowledge, sexual politics, neoliberalism, and religion. And she's published in a number of very prestigious journals, including the Journal of Marriage and the Family, Ethnography, Sexualities, Political Power and Social Theory, Theory and Event, and the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. And she's got a number of chapters in edited collections. She was also selected as the Exemplary Diversity Scholar by the University of Michigan National Center for Institutional Diversity in 2013. Evren Savcı received her PhD in sociology from the University of Southern California, and her master's and bachelor's degrees in sociology from the University of Virginia. Following her PhD, she was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Sexualities Project at Northwestern University. We're very pleased that Evren is also an advisory board member at Sugender. She's also contributing as a jury member to our prestigious Shirin Tekeli Research Award. We're very pleased to have her on the board again as a jury member this year. And in the past, she's been a part of the Mapping Gender Network. So she's been a part of a colloquium of scholars that Sugender and the Orient Institute in Istanbul brought together in discussing what gender and sexuality studies meant in Ottoman and Turkish studies, and her chapter appeared in the book Mapping Gender, and it's a fascinating and scathing critique of women's studies and gender studies centers in the United States. We're very pleased that her article appeared in the book. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome her and leave the floor to her so that she can present her book. And then, as I said, to newcomers, maybe it's going to be new, but we're going to have a 40-minute discussion after Evren's presentation. Evren, we're very pleased to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hülya. My apologies to everybody as well for making you wait. I did have unexpected Zoom screen sharing difficulties, but hopefully we're gonna kind of work around that and you will see my slides. It's a great pleasure to be here at Sugender to talk about my book, Queer in Translation, Sexual Politics Under Neoliberal Islam with you. And before I start, let me sincerely thank Hülya for inviting me, to her and to Begüm and to Didem for their assistance with making the event possible, and to everyone else that is involved in Sugender for hosting me today, and for also kind of being my academic kind of lifeline connection to Turkey over the years. It's really nice. And thanks to Hülya again for the introduction. So what I would like to do today is take a few minutes. Maybe we can have the first cover slide up if that works, Didem. And I'll just signal the shifts. So what I would like to do today is to take a few minutes to tell you about the larger book project, and then share one of the stories in the book. And in the Q&A, we can talk more about the larger theoretical framework or any of the other chapters, or this particular chapter that I'm going to talk about. Queer in Translation, so this is fine, this slide can stay. Queer in Translation is the study of sexual and queer politics that unfolded under the marriage between neoliberalism and Islam as devised by the Turkey's AKP regime. I'm just gonna say AKP since I have mostly a Turkish audience here, which has been in power since 2002. Back in 2008, when I started research, the AKP government under the leadership of then Prime Minister Erdogan was rapidly working on democratizing the country within the context of the European Union membership accession process. That was also a time when the LGBT Pride March was quite large and was growing in size every year. This will be familiar to some of you who were kind of around at the time. Fast forward to 2015, and the LGBTI plus Pride March was attacked by the police with tear gas and plastic bullets. The Kurdish peace process was in shambles, and heavily Kurdish populated towns in Diyarbakir were put under siege by the military. Erdogan was lecturing at disrespectful feminists to behave properly, claiming that abortion is murder, and telling all families to have at least 3 children. This shift from democratization to authoritarian crushing of all dissent is the object of my study, which I attribute to the rise of neoliberal Islam. Following Inderpal Grewal, I suggest that if neoliberal capitalism is a system that produces increasing precarity for larger groups of people through the disappearance of the middle class, the rise of surplus existence, the disappearing of welfare and related social safety nets, rising dispossession and rising debt, and crushing of labor unions. And if it justifies such inequality via moralizing mechanisms, such as the production of the categories of deserving and undeserving poor, the rise of respectability politics, increasing individualization of responsibility, an emphasis on self-sufficiency and self-entrepreneurialism, then, in the case of Turkey, I argue, Islamic morality factors as the key mechanism through which neoliberalism is domesticated, and through which the government designates between the deserving and the undeserving, between the good moral citizens and the bad immoral elements conspiring with foreign powers for the government's downfall, and between those who need to be securitized and those who will aid with securitization. Queer politics, I suggest, in particular emerge as a site where the effects of the existing regime of morality, as well as resistances to it, become crystallized. Let me quickly clarify. My use of the word Islam throughout the book is not intended to homogenize its meaning or suggest that there is an essence to it. I rather argue for contextualizing Islam as a lived reality grounded in political economy and government rule, as opposed to its current treatment in queer studies, which is my intellectual home, as a symbol or a discursive device. While my main goal in the book has been to illustrate the complexities of sexual politics under neoliberal Islam, the stories I recount also, and perhaps inevitably, demonstrate the multiplicity of Islam among those who live it and speak on its behalf, despite the Turkish government's increasing efforts to homogenize and monopolize its meaning. Such a project on contemporary sexual politics in Turkey inevitably presented a number of larger epistemological challenges and puzzles. So one is, how can we think about sexual formations in Turkey with insights from queer studies, given Turkey is a Muslim majority country with an Islamist government that has grown increasingly authoritarian and autocratic? This presents a challenge, particularly because most, not all, but most work in queer studies that deals with Islam focuses on Muslims as immigrants and in Muslim minority contexts through the frameworks of homonationalism and pinkwashing. These frameworks also inevitably position Muslims as targets of Western modernity and neo-imperialism in analyses that focus on the deployment of, for instance, alleged Muslim homophobia in justifications of the US war on terror. Again, how can we think about sexual formations in Turkey, given the existing debate on knowledge production, colonial modernity, and cultural imperialism, without reproducing the universalism versus particularism binary? In other words, how to think about sexual politics in contemporary Turkey without understanding it as a result of cultural universalism produced by global modernity, or as radical alterity that presents an alternative and resistance to Western cultural imperial forms. In order to engage with these questions, my project makes a double move. So we can move on to the next slide and click twice. For one, I locate my discussions of Islam in the context of political economy, which situates Islam in the midst of neoliberal capitalist modernity instead of presenting it as modernity's radical alterity. This move also allows me to think about neoliberalism as an economic and cultural project that travels and takes on different shapes according to context. And second, I bring translation studies scholarship to bear on queer studies. Unpacking what role cultural difference has been made to play in queer studies' epistemic unconscious led me to question the underlying theory of language in the field. What I mean by this is noticing that when queer studies speaks of Islam, markers of modernity besides secularism fall wayside. But the fact that happens, it shouldn't lead us to simply add them back to the picture, such as also looking at the political economy. But we rather need to also ask why this has been so, what epistemic structures have enabled it, and what epistemic structures continue to perpetuate an easy distinction between West and East, North and South. Translation as a methodology allowed me to break out of that epistemic structure and is built on certain assumptions regarding not only cultural difference, but also language. Historicizing what we consider language and making room for its hermeneutic dimensions and not treating it as only discourse helps refocus my analysis to social disjunctures produced by the travel and translation of vocabularies of sexual political modernity to Turkey. In other words, understanding language as a historical, practical human activity helps us break out of the rather strict mold of discourse and think about whether certain addresses arrive at all when they're posed, but also about how exactly those addresses arrive at their destination. This approach also breaks the unspoken equation of language equals culture equals difference, complicates the local, and makes room for the messiness of the travel and of the travel of meaning. As a result, we move away both from understanding sexual politics as colonial mimicry or looking for its indigenous formations, presumed to be pre-modern, and therefore reproducing the universal particular binary by reifying cultural difference. Let me now turn to a story to illustrate some of these dynamics I analyze and interventions I seek to make. So we can move on to the next slide. In fact, the next slide is just and maybe we can, this is why I told people, like, I have so many things to click through. Sorry, Didam, for making you do this. Click through all of them. So this is the, yeah, this is good. This is the outline of the book, and Who Killed Ahmet Yildiz is the chapter I will be speaking about today. So we can move on to the next one. Ahmet Yildiz was a 26-year-old Kurdish college student at Marmara University, majoring in physics and a participant. In fact, we can go back one click if you don't mind. Majoring in physics and a participant in the bear subculture when he was shot to death one late evening walking back to his car after having purchased some ice cream from Tuana Cafe in the Üsküdar neighborhood of Istanbul. Ahmet's father was subsequently charged with the murder and found guilty. Ahmet's death was covered in the national media immediately, and all 6 Turkish papers that reported on the incident the following day mentioned that Ahmet was a homosexual man. They used the Turkish word eşcinsel, that he had been receiving threats from his family and had filed an official complaint with Istanbul Governor's Office, which had not granted Ahmet any protection. While all these news pieces acknowledged that Ahmet's death might be related to the fact that he was gay and to the threats he had been receiving from his family, it was the British paper, The Independent, that you're seeing on the screen, that for the first time used the term honor killing to talk about Ahmet's murder. And we can go on to the next bit on the slide. So it wasn't just The Independent. Now you're also seeing the piece in the New York Times that appeared about Ahmet's murder a little later that kind of uses a similar tone. So my goal in talking about this story and its national and transnational circulation is to make 3 major points which relate to the travel of 3 key terms and the logics that inform them that I take up in this chapter: outness, families of choice, and honor killings. To elaborate, with Outness, I track the travel of this framing device to tell Ahmet's story and argue that a closer look at Ahmet's life and death shows that his story complicates the simplistic narrative of how aspirations for an out and proud life came up against backwards traditions. With Families of Choice, I track the transnational circulation of this story, especially among what might be identified as a global gay community, and show how this circulation was enabled by already established frameworks of queer families of choice, which is predicated, among other things, upon LGBT people as a distinct sexual minority. These frameworks, I argue, do two things. One, they inform how stories such as Ahmet's will be constructed in order to gain circulation. Two, they produce their own object positions, as we will see in the story of Ümmühan Darama, who was the sole witness to the murder and a Muslim single mother. Figures like her, who are produced as other sexual others of the Turkish nation, are rendered illegible by minority politics. I will also show that a liberal and juridical understanding of justice and the framing that follows from it hides other injustices, as well as alternative epistemologies through which to understand Ahmet's story. Finally, the frame of honor killing presents family violence nationally as a Kurdish and transnationally as an Eastern or Muslim pathology. So since Kurds in Turkey are the largest ethnic minority and have been and continue to face immense discrimination, state violence, and ethnic erasure, I find this attribution of family violence to the eastern and southeastern parts of Turkey nationally and to Muslim countries transnationally to reinforce the link between sexuality, racialization, and civilization. The theoretical interventions I am making through these points are, one, we can go just one by one. Okay, so let's stop, yeah. Suggesting that we broaden through tracking outness like this, I suggest that we broaden our understanding of what constitutes the political and what speech acts in fact serve to interrupt heteronormative orders other than coming out. I'm also suggesting that figures like Ahmet are neither subjects mimicking Western gaze, nor do they constitute radically different indigenous alternatives. Two, that our discussions of justice need to take into consideration who counts as a legible subject and a recognizable minority, and who is left outside of these economies of belonging altogether. This point will also serve as a reminder that heteronormativity is an epistemic structure that shapes how we understand the world, including the injustices in it. Therefore, I suggest heteronormativity cannot be solely understood as a reified structure that discriminates against already established LGBT people, but one that structures how we come to understand inequalities based on sexuality. So, and in fact, here I'm echoing Kathy Cohen's famous argument around the important distinction between heterosexuality and heteronormativity. I also suggest that we need to put pressure on the privileging of eventful deaths and expand our understanding of violence to consider the everyday slow deaths of citizen subjects. So we can continue. And then finally, I argue for a transnational rethinking of normativities that are produced both in the Turkish nation and the West, instead of imagining these normativities to be produced and upheld within national borders. So we can kind of bring all these down and then move on to the next slide. So now let's return to Ahmet's story. As I mentioned a minute ago, I just think that it's useful for me to go down the talk once so that you can track the story through the theoretical interventions. So as I mentioned a minute ago, the assassination of Ahmet Yıldız hit the Turkish news the day after Ahmet was shot to death in Istanbul on July 16th, 2008. Again, as I mentioned, while the Turkish papers reported that he was a homosexual man and he had been receiving threats from his family, it was the British paper, The Independent, that for the first time used the term honor killing to talk about Ahmet's murder. Several days after Ahmet's death, The Independent ran a full-page piece featuring the story with the headline, Was Ahmet Yıldız the victim of Turkey's first gay honor killing? The piece suggested that Ahmet was a victim of an increasingly liberal society and its entrenched conservative traditions, and frictions between old mentalities and growing civil liberties, citing a Lambda Istanbul activist who they just said that. These frictions were due to Turkey's recent liberalization and hence its inevitable transition towards becoming a country that respects civil liberties. The paper explained. We can go on to the next slide and bring all the pieces down. Turkey was all but close to the world until 1980, but its desire for European Union membership has imposed strains on a society formerly kept on a tight leash. Conveniently leaving out the fact that 1980 also marks the last and arguably bloodiest military coup in the Turkish Republic that led to the crushing of the left in the nation, as well as details such as how the unleashing of the nation, formerly on a tight leash, involved, among other things, the liberalization of Turkish economy, which resulted in an ever-expanding foreign debt, leading to a major economic crisis in 2001, so not much long time ago before the running of this news. The Independent employed a popular neoliberal storyline of civil, and in this case, gay rights as signs of democracy and progress. Only able to recognize as violence the murder of bodies intelligible as gay, this framework also fails to see the fact that the structural adjustment policies imposed by the IMF and World Bank on liberal economies that fail constitute simply another form of tight leash and unfold into, to borrow Lauren Berland's term, slow deaths of many citizens. The independence narrative, based on such narrow liberal and neoliberal understanding of freedom, individual freedoms of recognizable minority subjects and individual rights, also informed the paper's presentation of Ahmet as a young man who just wanted to live a happy out life. It was publicizing one's liberalness in the face of entrenched conservative traditions that was putting LGBT people like him in danger. So now we're returning to the first theme in the story that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, outness. We can move to the next slide. Outness was a major narrative in both the news. Ahmet was killed by his family because he was gay and because he had come out to his parents, and also in activist circles as well as among Ahmet's friends, most of whom belonged to the bear subculture and was informed by what Eve Sedgwick termed the epistemology of the closet. This epistemology is not only constitutive of and constituted by a homo-hetero split, but produces two and only two ontological possibilities. One is out or one is not, and hence is closeted. Joseph Massad has critiqued what he sees as an increasing imposition of this epistemology by international LGBT activism onto, in his case, the Arab world, and has argued that the imposition of the homo-hetero-binary onto desiring subjects only works to further heterosexualize the world by pushing people into identifying as heterosexual normals, right? However, I want to suggest that there are alternatives to a rigid epistemology of the closet on one hand, and an authentic sexuality and desires untouched by Western imperialism on the other. For instance, during a special meeting called to discuss the protest to be staged for Ahmet's murder on the terrace of Lambda Istanbul offices, one of the activists reported to the rest of us that a couple of friends of Ahmet's had given an interview to the Daily Sabah earlier in the day at Lambda Istanbul's premises, where they had made statements such as, Ahmet should not have told his parents that he was gay. While Lambda Istanbul didn't have a rigid politics that demanded everyone who is gay to come out, and they were in fact very careful about not photographing those who were not out to their families during their meetings and protests, they nevertheless held outness as an ideal that would be realized by anyone who would want to and felt safe to do so, and ideally by every LGBT subject one day. Yet the conversations that took place during the interview show how Ahmet's friends complicate this narrative, where they identify as gays and as bears, actually more specifically. They do not believe in coming out, but they also lead a life refusing to fold themselves into a heteronormative order their parents wish for them. We can move on to the next slide and to the first item. So when their parents brought up marriage, for instance, they responded with, "It will happen if it's my kismet," or pointed out examples of unhappy marriages around them. Hence, they didn't engage in marriage refusal by coming out, but by situating marriage as an institution that is, for one, a path that leads to unhappiness for enough people that one should question it as a social good, and two, a path not simply meant for everyone and therefore not prescribable to everyone. While such responses were seen as apolitical and made Lambda Istanbul activists nervous at the time, as they were seen and heard as anti-coming out narratives, I suggest that we need to move beyond individual acts of coming out as the only political interruptions of a heteronormative order and see what kinds of important political potentials are encapsulated by these acts of marriage resistance. While these statements are not made of explicit political concerns and are positioned as idare etmek by the men who make them, by managing the situation, for those of you who don't speak Turkish, by destabilizing marriage as a social good that can be uniformly prescribed to subjects, these men are ultimately refusing what Sara Ahmed calls the promise of happiness offered by the institution of marriage, but also refusing the promise of happiness offered by coming out. Here, I want to point out that this case offers something different from Martin Manalansan's famous critique of outness, departing from his study of Filipino gay man subjectivities. Manalansan's interviewees suggested that coming out was a white man's drama, that gayness was something to be felt, and that their families simply knew about their sexuality without them needing to perform a speech act, needing to say anything. There are various differences in these cases, of course, between mine and his, including immigrant subjectivities versus local subjectivities, and the existence versus absence of a nationally recognized queer subjectivity, such as bakla in his case. But perhaps more importantly, the bear community's aesthetic valuation of hairy, larger, and at times balding, and certainly older male bodies means that the bear looks overlap with extremely conventional tropes of Turkish heteromasculinity. The bear aesthetics, in other words, leaves no room for anything to be felt by one's family in the context of Turkey regarding one's gayness. And it is not predicated on subverting, but rather embodying gender norms. In other words, unlike Manalansan's Filipino gay men, who did not feel they needed to come out to be felt as gay, Turkish bears would have to come out to make their gayness known. The discursive performances they prefer, however, are not those about who they are as individuals, but those that speak to what marriage is as an institution, which also ultimately interrupts and transcends the homo-hetero-binary. So it's not that marriage is not good for gays, marriage is not good for anyone, right, in their rhetoric. We can move to the next slide. Further, Ahmed himself offers a complex narrative around questions of outness in a letter he wrote for the online bear magazine Bergi 6 months before his murder. While Ahmed's piece was titled, "Don't Lie, Take Off Your Mask and Be Proud," he expressed conflicting feelings around coming and being out and sounded cautious about recommending it. We can click a couple of more times. The theoretical experience, this is Ahmed writing, the theoretical experiences I had gained from my friends told me that I would be telling the truth and feel proud. Yes, I am proud because I have gotten rid of lies, but know that you will be starting a difficult fight and always avoid telling them if you think it will be hard for your family to understand you. Situating a simple conception of outness equaling pride and joy as theoretical, Ahmed clearly complicates any out and proud rhetoric and ends his letter with the suggestion that the readers avoid telling their parents if they believe their parents will have a hard time understanding them. This gesture towards an epistemic break between families and selves cannot be accounted for by a simple rhetoric of homophobia, backward cultures, and violent families. While he claims some pride and does understand telling the truth about his sexuality to be important, Ahmed nevertheless voices ambiguity about the disjuncture between theory and practice, and is torn between feeling happy to no longer live with lies and the difficulties he now experiences as a result of having come out. Not having fulfilled its promise of happiness, outness as a gay social good occupies a more ambiguous place in this narrative than what would be found in the media portrayals of the story that prescribe certain forms of being and living as a gay man. Ahmet's understanding of his sexuality and his understanding of his parents' reaction does not constitute colonial mimicry or a radical alterity to Western modernity, an instance of cultural difference. So now we're going to move on to the second term we're tracking, families of choice. Oh, sorry. So there is a clip that I need to show you, but maybe will be, since I can't screen share, maybe I'll tell you about it because I didn't queue this up. I normally have this ready myself. So Ahmet's murder, of course, happened in a transnational world where not only did news flow in and out of Turkey, but also other narratives and discourses, some of which were informed by transnational identity movements and sexual subcultures. Soon after Ahmet's death, his friends produced the following YouTube video. In fact, since we have a bit of time, I'm gonna put this in the chat and maybe we can, them can play it. I'll just put the, give me 1 second. I'll just get the link. We'll just see if it works. And if not, I'm happy to just tell you about the video. But if it's going to be hard to get out of the screen share and get into the video, I'm also happy to just, it's a very short video that people can watch after the talk. You guys tell me what works best.
I can try.
Okay, thank you so much. The sound is not, yeah. But because you're muted, I think, Didam.
Okay.
And Ahmet was part of my family.
Could we restart from the beginning, Didam? Just very quickly. It's a very short video.
My name is Ed Caraballo from New York City, and Ahmet was part of my family.
Kaixo, Joseba naiz, Euskal Herriko semea eta Ahmet nere familia da.
I'm Alex from Barcelona. Hello, my name is Ron. I'm from Florida.
My name is Brian, and I'm from Brisbane, Australia.
My name is Mike from Louisiana in the United States. My name is Stephen Curtis from London, Ontario, Canada. And Ahmet is my family.
Bonjour, je suis français et Ahmet est ma famille.
And Ahmet is my family.
And Ahmet is part of my family.
Ahmet es mi familia.
And Ahmet is my family.
Hola, soy Salvador de Barcelona. Ahmet es mi familia.
And Ahmet is my family.
Hola, me llamo Jaime. Soy de Chile y Ahmet es mi familia.
And Ahmet was part of my family.
Thank you. So in the clip, the various languages in both spoken and written form evoke an international family that embraces Ahmet, each speaker marked by national and often colonial languages. The national borders, presumed to be marked by national languages, are overcome by this gesture of translatability of the sentiments captured by the phrase, Ahmet is my family, and its many linguistic iterations. Queer families are thus presented as a global phenomenon and queer kinship as a universalizable sentiment. As you saw, towards the end of the clip, we were presented with two signs. Can we click on the next one too, Didam? Ahmet Yıldız was a victim of a gay honor killing. Ahmet Yıldız missed by his real family. While such transnational embrace of Ahmet as a member of a family who loves and accepts him for who he is well-intentioned, families we choose as a narrative framework creates a distinction between right kinds of families and wrong kinds of families, thereby hiding the fact that family as an institution is home to all kinds of violence, ranging from incest to domestic violence. As honor killing travels internationally to tell the story of what happens to, in this case, gay people in alleged backwards third world countries, it is used to discipline kinship structures into becoming neoliberal families where family is supposed to function as a safe haven and provide love, support, protection, and any other social services citizens might need. This is exemplified in the Istanbul Governor's Office's initial refusal to provide protection to Ahmet when he filed a complaint against threats he was receiving from his family, and the subsequent murder trial, at the end of which, as I mentioned, Ahmet's father was charged with the crimes and found guilty. In other words, neoliberalism shrinking of the social functions of the state and crafting of the private family as the proper sphere of care and safety dictates where the state can and should withdraw from the site defined as the family, as well as where it will intervene with its disciplinary functions. Sentiments evoked by the Ahmet is my family video embody and foster such neoliberal constructions of family, critiquing failed families, failed on a neoliberal scale of success, and contributing to the ideology of Western family romance. Disconnected from blood ties, it is those who care for you, love you unconditionally, and even better, love you for who you are. Next slide. This video circulated on several websites, including a tribute site for Ahmet. One YouTube link that received the highest circulation with over 50,000 views featured over 300 comments, mostly echoing the sentiments in the video. People posting their names, their locations, and claiming Ahmet as their family. In addition, several other voices emerged that were critical of who or what they thought had killed Ahmet Yıldız. While comments such as Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion, sarcasm, crafted a direct link between Islam as religion and honor killings in general, and killing of a gay man in particular, other comments such as, I feel bad for the LGBT communities in Muslim countries, it's just so bad over there, very sad, imagined Islam as a national trait or national culture. Others were threatened by the proximity of an Islamic barbaric Turkey. If Turkey will be an EU member, we're going to let Spain to feed them. Is that okay with you? Want it or not, Turkey is a Muslim country. You can't change their traditions, and configured Islam as tradition. But either as religion, national trait, or tradition, Islam was imagined to be at the root of honor killings. While transnational circuits were linking honor killing to Islam with few voices contesting it, the court case back in Istanbul was getting ready to move forward with a single witness, Ümmühan Darama. As a woman with Islamic education from a very early age, Darama partially made a living through private group seminars she gave on Islamic ethics. She also had owned several businesses, the last one of which was the cafe in front of which Ahmet was shot. Darama herself was injured during the shooting, with a bullet hitting her in one of her heels. During my lengthy interview with her, she told me that she suspected that she herself might have been the target of the bullets. She had been married to her ex-husband by Islamic matrimony, which has no legal standing in Turkey without also conducting a secular official engagement. Since the passing away of her ex-husband, with whom she had a son, Darama had been trying to get her son to receive his share of the inheritance. While her husband had registered their son as officially his, the uncles who did not want him to receive any inheritance had had the official relationship removed from the records, Dharma told me. She didn't know how much money was involved, but had traveled to Switzerland to find out about the bank account there. She told me after she began going after her son's inheritance, her businesses became the subject of attacks. In fact, her cafe had been shot at a few times 3 months after Ahmet's death again. Dharma took that as a warning, as the shooting had happened at night when no one was there, and closed the cafe, mostly because she was worried for her employees' well-being. While she was confused about how her own fight for justice for her son might have coincided with Ahmet's death, she strongly believed that there was a link and that this court case might result in finally exposing and penalizing those who had been trying to harm her businesses and intimidate her into giving up on her search for the inheritance. While Ahmet's story, a gay honor killing, received international media attention and easily fit into the narratives of transnational justice movements and was able to mobilize them, other sexual others of the Turkish nation, such as Muslim single mothers who only engage in Islamic matrimony, do not have any transnational or, for that matter, national movements that will support their search for justice. Not recognized by the legitimizing institutions of the nation state or by national and transnational movements for justice, such as feminist or queer movements, figures such as Dharma truly queer identitarian movements that are able to recognize only othering but not objection. What I mean by this is that Ahmet's story becomes recognizable transnationally the moment he's called a gay subject who was the target of easily identifiable violence. Dharma, on the other hand, does not constitute a recognizable subject position that is already established as a minority in a liberal and neoliberal framework, which has the potential to be folded into multicultural diversity projects. Neither is her continuous battle with state institutions and with the invisible powers that she suspected her deceased husband's male kin represented identified as violence. We can click a couple of times more, I think. Yeah. This is not to portray Dharma as an opportunist, given her stated self-interest in this case. And I hope I make it clear that the structural impossibilities for her fight to exert the kind of pressure that transnationally backed justice movements are able to exert. Further, Dharma's desire to be a witness for Ahmet's case was not only informed by her own search for justice, but also by her beliefs as a Muslim woman. Homosexuality is haram, but murder is the biggest sin, she had told the Daily Radikal, the only Turkish paper that featured a lengthy conversation with her. When I asked her to elaborate on this point during our interview, she told me that murder is absolutely unacceptable in Islam and subjects, kullar, do not have the right to punish. She added, homosexuality is haram, but so is smoking, while chain smoking herself during our 3.5-hour conversation, which involved a brief interruption for her to buy another pack of cigarettes. She explained that the reason homosexuality was haram, just like smoking, was that it was harmful to the human body that, after all, we borrow from Allah. She said, but during my seminars, married couples also ask me about this. So what are you going to do? Thus, treating homosexuality as anal sex acts, which she understood to be harmful to the body, but engaged by many, including heterosexual married couples who come to her seminars, Dharma did away with the homo-hetero-binary and disrupted the epistemology of the closet. Her fairly individualistic understanding of religious duty and sin, on the other hand, troubled discourses of liberal tolerance. We'll go to the next slide. If gay honor killing is an archive that gains, we can stop. Okay. If gay honor killing is an archive that gains robustness, coherence, and consistency as it circulates transnationally, then Dharma is a figure who haunts this archive. She disrupts not only the Islamophobia that sticks to honor killings as a backward and traditional form of crime, but also the easy narratives of exclusion, violence, and justice that are evoked by the archive both in and outside of Turkey. The fact that Dharma found herself excluded from state mechanisms of justice, familial networks, and social justice movements speaks to the instability of binaries of the state versus the family and state mechanisms versus social justice movements. It also reveals the pervasive logics of not only homonationalism and Islamophobia, but also the multicultural exclusions of neoliberal Islam in Turkey. Her story is a testimony to what we have to gain from moving beyond the possibilities of identitarian politics and from adopting an expansive vision of what forms of violence are being perpetrated on all kinds of citizen subjects, because their sexualities, intimacies, and kinship formations are left outside of the legitimizing institutions of, in this case, the neoliberal Islamist nation state. Finally, I want to point out that gay honor killing works as a narrative that contributes to a national as well as a transnational division of labor between what is considered to be the West versus the non-West, mapping family violence onto the non-West and producing the myth of the West as the location of stranger danger. So we can do one more click. While it is, thank you, common to encounter attributions of honor killings to Muslim cultures transnationally, if the feminist humanitarian critique comes out of Muslim majority countries or is produced by Muslim authors, among whom it is common knowledge that honor killings are denounced by Islamic religious authorities, it is frequently Kurds and Kurdish feudal customs that are presented as responsible for honor killings. This is true for Turkey as well, where honor killings are traditionally attributed to Kurdish feudal customs referred to as töre. Dicle Kouacıoğlu aptly termed this move the tradition effect, given that such analyses erase the state's responsibilities really in cases of honor killings by pulling funding from shelters or justifying police insensitivity towards women trying to run away from violent marriages. What I want to add to her analysis is a caution against the privileged place of sudden death as violence in discussions of honor killings. Many slow deaths transpire at the hands of family members as well as other social institutions and the state, and these need to be a part of our thinking about violence as well. So in this slide, I want to ask what counts as murder. A consideration of slow deaths is especially necessary in the context of the historical and current treatment of Kurdish subjects by the Turkish state, which has included divestment from heavily Kurdish populated regions, burning down of villages and forced migration of tens of thousands, as well as innumerable arbitrary detentions and jailings of Kurdish people under anti-terrorism acts. Töre provides a racializing script in the nation that produces honor killings as a Kurdish pathology and singles out sudden deaths, which are enacted by Kurdish bodies on Kurdish bodies, allegedly. So these become newsworthy and real violence, adding to the neoliberal understanding of the family as a natural safe haven. Meanwhile, the unnaming of the distribution of slow deaths to many Kurdish children and adults by the Turkish state for a long time marked such violence as less significant because it was seen as less murderous. To put it somewhat more bluntly, Ahmet could have been one of those lives in the heavily Kurdish populated towns in southeast of Turkey who was unable to survive or flourish due to death-like conditions produced by successive states of emergencies declared by various Turkish governments, and his death would not have attracted the attention that it did due to transnational LGBT movements. And I highly doubt, and we know that none of those lives or deaths make it to the front page of journals like The Independent. On the other hand, you can go on to the next slide. The use of honor killing situates Ahmet's murder as an Eastern and in some contexts Muslim form of crime, and hence provides a constitutive outside for Western homonormativity. Scholars have questioned the very term honor killing, pointing out that a third of all women killed in the US are murdered by their husbands, boyfriends, or fathers. Yet no specific term exists to name such killings a particular form of Western pathology. Through the employment of honor killing, family violence is relegated to the East to conserve both the Western family romance and the myth of stranger danger. We can do, I think, 4 more clicks. Critics of neoliberalism in the US have shown a shift from discussions of, this is just to give you some background about how conversations here work. Critics of neoliberalism in the US have shown a shift from discussions of incest to pedophilia in the late 80s that shifted the responsibility for child sexual abuse from heterosexual fathers in the case of incest to gay male unknowns in the case of pedophilia, And that shifted criminalization from predominantly white households to allegedly strangers of color, and produced the myth of stranger danger, right? That danger always comes from strangers and not from people we know. Attention to transnational discourses such as these helps resituate the current discussions around neoliberalism and homonormativity in the West from being imagined in relationship to particular normativities produced within the American nation, for instance, to considering over and against which nations and bodies such projects are built. So we can maybe go to the next one. So as you can see, I'm arguing that there are parallel moves both at national and transnational levels in which civilizational narratives link processes of racialization and sexuality, marking the locations of family violence as the failures of civilization. So then something like state violence becomes a more civilized form of violence, and family violence becomes a more backward form of violence. And we can move on to the next slide for the conclusion. No, go back one. Just, yeah, that's good. Thank you. So this is a picture I took at the Pride March in Istanbul in the summer of 2012, when we could still have Pride marches. As you can see, friends of Ahmet's and members of the community 4 years after his murder were still marching with signs demanding justice for Ahmet's murder, especially since the charge of Ahmet's father with the murder had not resulted in his arrest. While the framing of Ahmet's story away from finding out who killed Ahmet Yildiz, with the framing of the story away from finding out who killed Ahmet Yildiz, I certainly don't mean to undermine efforts by Ahmet's friends to seek justice for his murder. But I suggest that his story allows us to ask questions as to what counts as justice, who benefits from existing structures of it, who feels satisfied with what they deliver, what lives are always already left out of these structures, and what deaths are rendered ungrievable. There are ways to tell Ahmet's story that do not rely on frameworks of honor killing, outness, and families of choice, and that do not rely on alleged alternatives that end up reifying custom, tradition, locality, and cultural authenticity. There are ways to understand his story and imagine justice, compassion, and finding different ways of living meaningful and self-determined lives. While the details of Ahmet's murder might remain the same, envisioning other ways of understanding his life and death remain important, given that language, knowledge, and ways of thinking about the world travel more intensively than ever before, and because we all live our lives in the light and the shadows of narratives that unfold within the context of intensifying transnational connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evren, for this fascinating talk.